It is my great pleasure to welcome you delegates to the first Asia-Pacific regional meeting on the 10-year framework programs for sustainable consumption and production. This is an initiative that is of extreme importance for the future of our planet, certainly for the future of life on our planet. And I want to share with you a few thoughts about how we have to go forward in this area. I'm here in two capacities. First, as co-chair of the International Resource Panel, an initiative of the United Nations Environment Programme, and chair of Development Alternatives, a social enterprise based in New Delhi, which has been working on these issues for the past 30-odd years. Both United Nations Environment Programme and its International Resource Panel, as well as Development Alternatives, are dedicated to the proposition that the world ought to be a more sustainable place for all people. The Earth today is in high fever. We have climate change, we have the massive extinction of species, we have loss of land, we're creating deserts at the rate of 50,000 square kilometers every year around the world. We have basically a huge problem with the availability of certain resources. We call it peak oil because the fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, are now in a state of depletion that means that we will only have them for a few more decades. And although there's a lot of talk about these new kinds of oils from shale and tight gas and so on, the fracking that is being done in several places around the world, we're not going to have very many extra years from even all of that. So we have something that is really going on that has never happened in the history of the planet before. Peaking of many of our resources. For example, food. We now have riots in the streets, governments falling. We have problems with fisheries. We've got problems with the biogeochemical cycles that support food production, like phosphates and nitrogen. We basically are in very serious trouble on the resource end. We can see from the prices of food, which used to be stable for decades, if not centuries, over the last 5 or 6 years, they have started jumping up and down in a way that signals real problems ahead. And the whole thing is about the ecological footprint of humankind. We are taking away from Mother Earth far more than she's capable of renewably producing every year. Our ecological footprint today is now over 1.5. That means we're using 50% more resources than we're entitled to be on a stable path. And a very, very large part of the problem is that this is growing at a rapid rate. So we now need to learn how to use the planet's resources more efficiently and productively. There is, of course, the whole issue of resources, and there's the whole issue of demography, the number of people demanding those resources, especially because our aspirations are growing all the time. And so when you combine these three things, depletion of resources, growing populations, and exploding aspirations, you get a very, very bleak picture of our planet. When you really consider it, the key to conserving our natural resources is to bring about a whole change in our consumption patterns and our production systems. Sustainable consumption and production are really the key to our future. The way that we can do this, of course, is to try and have our cake and eat it. We have to respond to the climate change issues, the adaptation to what will happen anyway, and mitigation to try and prevent more of it happening, but also to improve the lives of people at the same time by creating jobs, by removing the kinds of obstacles that people face in improving their own lives. So in order to do this, we need a triple whammy to find ways in which we can do all kinds of things at the same time, all of which benefit us. In agriculture we can do this, in industry we can do this in our daily lives by adopting more conserving approaches, improve our lives. This is something that's quite easy if we were to, for example, make more and more use of renewable energy like solar and wind and biogas and a variety of other types of energy that don't involve digging large amounts of stuff out of the ground. This can be done with better construction technologies. After all, construction is one of the greatest users of natural resources. Making houses, making roads, making bridges, making ports takes up a huge amount of materials, and we are in a position to change those completely. Here is an example of a building that we built in South Delhi. In fact, it's the headquarters of my own organization, which uses something like 50-60% less materials, less energy, less water, and has a fundamentally different kind of impact on nature. The first thing, of course, that we could do is to conserve our natural resources, things like our wetlands and our forests and our landscapes and our farmlands, where we are growing food and crops in a manner that is highly destructive to Mother Nature. We have to learn from nature itself, something which we call biomimicry, on how to develop all our production systems in a way that doesn't produce unwanted wastes and produces things that all of us need. Let me give you an example of biomimicry. One way you might want to treat your city's water is to build a huge, big, gigantic engineering works. Another way would be to let nature do the work for you by simply preserving and improving the wetlands around your city. So you can see that in one case you might have to spend literally billions of dollars and use large amounts of energy and resources, and in the other you don't have to spend anything, and in fact you can get huge extra returns simply by reviving nature. Unfortunately, resource use has been going up with economic well-being. And breaking this link is called decoupling. This diagram makes it quite easy to understand. It shows that the growth of the economy is growing at a fairly fast rate, but the growth of the use of resources has to be much slower if we are going to achieve some kind of sustainability in our lifetimes. It's interesting to know that over the centuries, last couple of centuries, technology has made such progress that the cost of resources kept coming down. Productivity of our mining and extraction systems were such that the price of almost all resources come down. But if you look at this graph, you will see that in the last decade, things have turned around. From now on, resource costs will be going up more and more. You take, for example, land. People have noticed that to grow food and energy and other things, land is very important. And in the year 2012, more land was bought overseas by foreign investors than the whole area of France. So we can imagine things have now begun to change completely. Resources are, of course, very important. Here is an example of the differences between different societies in our consumption patterns. This is a family in Europe which has displayed the kind of food that they eat in a week, and if it weren't for the fact that they waste something of the order of 40%, they would probably be having serious health problems. This is a family in Central Africa with its entire week's food rations, and they're having problems for an entirely different reason: malnourishment. So we can see now that as countries progress, as economies grow, their demand on resources also grows. This has been for 2.5 centuries the way things were. This diagram shows very clearly what we mean by decoupling. The economy is growing at the rate of the top line, and the use of resources is growing at a slower and slower rate. And decoupling requires us, absolute decoupling would require us to actually have fewer and fewer resources being used while our economies are improving. So the basic concepts that we are now trying to promote in our work on SCP, on resource management, is efficiency and productivity of resources. This means basically that we must do more with less. Indeed, the time has come for us to even consider doing less with less. And we can do this technologically. We can do this with new kinds of approaches to lighting, to mobility, to transport, to construction. There are all kinds of new ways in which science and technology are showing us that we can actually save resources while we get what we were looking for. Unfortunately, apart from a few common metals like aluminium and iron and copper, most minerals are not recycled in our economies. Some of the more precious ones, of course, gold and platinum and silver are, but the ones that are used in our new electronics economy are yet to be recycled. I believe that the concept of contraction and convergence becomes extremely important. Those who overutilize resources must bring their consumption down. Those who underutilize resources must find their way into the future by using more efficient, more productive means so that they don't have to go all the way up in the manner that industrialized countries did and then come down. The changes that are now needed are shown in this graph here. If we were to continue business as usual, we would go on going up and up and up the resource use curve. But of course we can't do that, and so we must find other ways in which to change. So incremental change, introducing some efficiencies in our machines and changing slightly our ways of doing things will give us a certain amount of respite, but it's only when we start making fundamental transformative changes. And as a consequence, the changes that we have to achieve will be significant ones. They're not going to be 10% or 50%. They're going to be a factor of 5, maybe factor of 10 very, very soon. Otherwise, we will not be able to maintain our sustainability paths. In the longer term future, one can even hope for factors of 50 in order to be able to meet everybody's needs. So that brings us to how do we go about doing this? The need today is for systemic approaches. Approaches to combining basic needs with the imperatives of the environment, our production systems and our consumption patterns, our ability to deliver sustainable livelihoods and at the same time to be able to create basic needs products. Ultimately, we've got to reconcile the differences of needs and viewpoints of both the global north and the global south. Ultimately, of course, this means that we have to get together and work in a way that will bring about true change on a global scale.